My name is Lexi Papaspirou. I'm the CEO of the Tech Talent Charter, and today I will be hosting our Signatory Forum on ERGs. So that's Employee Resource Groups. And today, the guest that we have with us is Chris Dunn from Lloyds Banking Group. Chris, I would love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lexi. Lovely to be asked to join and to be here. Yes, so I'm Chris Dunn. I currently work in Lloyds Banking Group. I'm sure we'll get to the crux of what I do at Lloyds Banking Group, but I like to say I've got a day job, which is Culture and Colleague Experience Lead in our Chief Customer Office. And then the gay job is that I'm co-lead of our LGBT plus colleague network, which is called Rainbow.
Great, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks for agreeing to have a chat with us today on this topic. So I would love to just start with a bit of a broad one for you, if it's okay. One of the questions that we get asked by signatories, and sometimes quite surprising signatories, ones with very mature diversity and inclusion functions, is what is an ERG? And I think that there are a lot of different names for the components that make up an ERG. So I would love you to just give us a bit of an overview here. What is an ERG? What is it comprised of?
Yeah, and actually, I think even seeing the letters ERG in the words Employee Resource Group, you know, even if you go organisation to organisation, that can change in terms of name and how those are set up. If I maybe give my own perspective from Lloyds, and the Employee Resource Group is basically, we call them colleague networks. So so they are groups of like-minded, people with similar values, experiences, communities, for want of a better term, that can come together with common purpose, shared values on particular topics.
Cool, Chris. So you were saying it's this group. You call them networks. They go by many different names, but the idea here is that ERGs are bringing together people who have a shared set of values, a shared set of experiences, and that's like a core function of what is happening when an ERG or a network that could be called an ERG, it comes together. So I would love to kind of get you to extend what you were just saying there a little bit around when you've got this group who have got these shared area of interest, concern, experience or value. What is the purpose then of having that network, that ERG?
I think from a purpose perspective, it's maybe two pronged. So the first is a business purpose. So actually, how can you bring colleagues together to, I suppose, help harness the collective power they've got from a cultural perspective? Engaged colleagues, happy colleagues are more productive colleagues, I suppose, is the very, very simplistic highline business purpose. And then more broadly, you've got the kind of colleague purpose and engaging those colleagues. And if you think of everything that's, particularly in present day, everything that's going on externally, you know, we spend so much of our lives in work, and actually bringing some of the external into the workplace and focusing on what's important to people individually really can help build engagement from a kind of professional perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying about the kind of blending of our work selves and our personal selves. And obviously with the pandemic and everything that's changed in recent years about how we now work, we've got some fascinating insights coming out in our forthcoming diversity in tech report, which looks into this, about what is now happening as the norm in terms of flexible work practices. And you know, I'd be really interested to get your view on this. Are we moving, I guess, towards a consistent and permanent way of working where there is just naturally a much greater blend of bringing your full and whole self to work? I know it's been something that's often spoken about as a preserve amongst organisations who are really leaning into DE&I, but is this a change that you have to kind of get on board with, whether you like it or not now as an organisation? Because if you're going to be able to secure and retain really good talent in your organisation, you need to create these inclusive spaces. And is this a direction of travel, I guess, from your point of view? Now, obviously, I know you work at Lloyds, which have really lent in and are really like a leader around inclusive practice here, but would love to just get your take on this. Is this something that you think is A, positive, and B, how do you see it kind of playing out amongst your colleagues at Lloyds, and then maybe further afield than that?
Yeah, I mean, if I take my own experiences, so I've been in Lloyds now for 20 years. I know I don't look old enough, but this will be my 20th year. And if I, even take my own experiences of thinking what it was like to be a colleague up in Glasgow, actually back then, to how it now feels 20 years later, and I think it feels incredibly different. So even thinking, the pandemic, I think, has probably accelerated a lot of companies thinking about how they want to work, where they want to work, and how they engage with their colleagues, whether that's in a hybrid way, whether it's remotely, whether it's in the office, and what are some of those things that they do to try and engage colleagues. I think you mentioned the pandemic, and I think certainly post-pandemic, there's certainly a lot of themes that have come out. Well-being, mental health, agile working, even things like domestic abuse, which were probably a little bit more tabooed from a few years ago, actually have really come to the fore. Illnesses, we've from a Lloyds perspective, we've just launched a kind of joined up kind of working with cancer initiative. We've done a lot of work with Mental Health UK over the last few years. We're about to start a new partnership with Crisis. So actually, the role of organisations in wider society and the expectation that society and colleagues and just people more generally will get involved and spend more time on not just work, but spend more time on cultural activity, societal issues as part of the working day, just seems to be much more, becoming much more part of the norm now.
Yeah, it's really interesting that ERGs are this mechanism. It's a formal way of organising that kind of blending of your whole self and then your work self by bringing these experiences that have traditionally not been maybe as welcome in the workplace into the workplace in a formal way and in a supportive way. And I would love to ask a bit about that, particularly with your experience working in ERGs and networks at Lloyds. How do you get the organisation to navigate this quite difficult line of people bringing things to networks at work that maybe are quite uncomfortable, that maybe don't feel great to share beyond the confines of an ERG, and a lot of these topics that ERGs are centered on can be on experiences that are deeply personal and sometimes quite troubling to the individuals who want to participate in them. So what can the employer do to ensure that they are creating an environment for a network or an ERG to be really supportive to the people who are electing to participate in them?
I mean, we talk a lot these days about psychological safety, and I think that's absolutely a necessity for those individuals to really bring themselves to work. But I think it starts kind of probably back at the beginning, Lexi, thinking about, what is an organisation's purpose? What's the culture that organisation is trying to foster? And then what are the values that they want to not just kind of write down on a piece of paper and file away or have on their company website, but what are the values that they're actually going to live and preach and absolutely stand by and defend? And then thinking beyond that, how do you then create these ERGs that hopefully are empowered and have the autonomy to kind of set themselves up, develop their own set of priorities, and really understand what will make a difference to the people within that organisation, because we're all different and we all have different wants, beliefs, things that are important to us, and that's just the same for any organisation and the people that are in those organisations. So what might be what might suit one organisation won't necessarily be the right fit for another. But I think the more information that organisations and the people who are hoping to take the charge and lead on cultural transformation and the cultural agenda within those organisations, the more you can expose yourself to sessions like this and what other organisations are doing, and you almost want to kind of fill your shopping cart with what you think might work for your organisation. So having the more insight, the better for me, I think.
That's really interesting. I know when you first said, let's step back here and look at foundationally, what does your individual organisation care about? What are your values? I think that's a really interesting one from the point of view that a lot of people might be going, well, how do I start approaching what an ERG is? So doing this kind of reflective piece, looking at what you care about, is super important. But then you also mentioned ERGs can evolve and develop their own autonomous priorities ring fenced within the organization. And I would love to just kind of dig into that a bit more. So say you've done your reflective piece and you've gone, we care deeply about making sure our people can bring their whole selves to work, that they have the safety to present their full selves and to be their best self at work. What is the next step that an organization can take? And the reason I'm asking this question is because we have a lot of small organizations within TTC, and they are on a diversity and inclusion journey, but also a journey in terms of their own growth. And sometimes working out how to make some of these ideas fit in a smaller organization or a growing organization is really tough. And because you've been at Lloyds for 20 years, you must have seen so much evolution of how these can get set up. What are the pitfalls? What are the things that you do need to make sure you're thinking about when you're practically going through the steps of looking at how do I create this network? Could you give us a bit of an insight into that?
Yeah, sure, Lexi. Excuse me. I think when you're starting out, it's important to think, let's start small. We're not going to, change the world, change the organization and change the culture in a day. So if you're starting small, it's thinking about what is the reason that you're doing it. What do you want to achieve when you're kind of setting out? And let's just take Rainbow and our LGBT plus network as an example, but the same could be said for family networks, women's networks, and so on. It's important to think about who can help. So who are the leaders of that organization, and how can you get this topic on their radar? And sometimes what I've found actually is just the easiest way to do that is just to be bold and that's actually one of our values now, is just to reach out and ask and try and get some time. And often, if they can't spare the time or they don't want to spend the time or whatever, there will be somebody with a listening ear that you can lean on. And then the kind of maybe stage 2 then is thinking about sponsorship from your leaders, and who's a right fit, who do colleagues naturally gravitate to, who's generally seen for being a cultural leader in that organization. And then thinking about who's more broadly, who is around you that can help, because you need boots on the ground, you need boots on the battlefield, and you can't. No one person can make this all succeed. So you'll need a team of like-minded people who are passionate about a particular cause or theme or topic to kind of get behind it and form that group. And actually, it might not be called an ERG to start with, or a colleague network. It could just be 3 or 4 people who've got some ideas and they want to kind of start making some change. They want to start running some listening sessions, or they want to put on a networking event. They want to try and identify a few mentors. So I think the maturity of your ERG and where your organization sits on that journey probably dictates a little bit about how you would go about that and what you might want to prioritize. If I think of Lloyds as an example, I think we very much focused on our women's network, which is called Breakthrough. Naturally, because if you're looking at any demographic, the gender demographic is probably easier to tap into, because as an organization, you've probably got our lower grades, you've probably got about 60 to 70% female mix versus your male colleagues. So actually, that's an easier ask to try and bring a group of people who are passionate about a particular topic and progressing an organization's culture around one topic, and then thinking about how you might then expand that as your kind of thinking and organization matures. And then the final bit, Lexi, I would probably mention is what we did was, thinking about our allies and champions, and who's got some loud voices that can help you, but also whether you bring into those discussions allies as well, because as we all know, allies are really fundamental in kind of progressing with any agenda. So, whether that's people supporting our race action plan, whether it's some of our male colleagues who are supporting our female progression, whether it's our LGBT plus allies, allies are really key to, as I say, progressing any of these agendas as well.
There is so much I would love to dig into here. I'm going to start by working back through what you were just saying about allies, because I think that's a fascinating question that comes up a lot from our conversations with different businesses. And that question is, should we be including allies in these types of employee networks? Because if they're supposed to be a safe space for certain groups that have this shared experience, then is that inviting potentially less safety by bringing in people who don't share those experiences? And these are very like authentically held and legitimate concerns that people are raising here. So what are your thoughts around this topic, and knowing that it's highly nuanced and complex and there may not be a straightforward answer?
You're right. I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is no straightforward answer. And I probably have two opinions, and they're both completely polar opposite. So one is, I think you need to be able to have and create the space for people to express themselves, be themselves, and have those safe and honest discussions. Those could happen on, one-on-one. You could organise some specific working groups or sub-work streams. And then the other side of that is the allies. We have we have allies within our LGBT plus network. We have allies leads that kind of coordinate activity, and you like to think that allies are what they say. They are allies, and they have common and similar thoughts and beliefs and values to you. And quite a lot of the things that allies need is basically a little bit of education. They are well-wishing, and they can make an absolute massive difference. So there's a key part there around educating and bringing those individuals with you, whilst also having somewhere that people can continue to be themselves. And also, I suppose that your organisation is mature enough that it has some framework in place to deal with perhaps instances where people aren't being as supportive as you would expect them to be. So I know that from speaking to some individuals, friends that I have, their organisations have been relatively small, and so they've initially decided to start just with particular demographics and groups of like-minded people who can come together, as I say, with those shared values and try and make a difference in those organisations, versus others who absolutely see the value in allies, and really want to bring them on that cultural transformation journey with them as well. So I don't think there's a one size fits all type view, Lexi. I think it really depends on individuals, the makeup of the organisation, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and it's something that I think causes a lot of disquiet for people, is working out, well, where do we sit in that overall landscape, and what is right for us right now. So it's really interesting to have that view of, who's making up this network, how, what stage is it at in its maturity, and particularly, as we mentioned about small organisations, that can be like that small group of dedicated and passionate individuals who want to come together, and then how do you then start to broaden that out? And I'd really like to take the conversation here a little bit to the word of leadership, because you've mentioned this a few times, and it's something that has been top of my mind as a person who's working on the Tech Talent Charter's annual report. We know that we're in a period of real economic stress, and businesses are cutting budgets where they can. Cost savings are being made everywhere, and DE&I is one of these areas that can sometimes really feel the brunt of those types of financial stresses. And there's a bit of nervousness, I guess, from my point of view, around what happens if ERGs and networks become the primary diversity and inclusion activity going on at an organisation that maybe isn't investing as much, and the work going into ERGs is therefore coming from people who are doing it as a side of desk project because they have a vested personal interest in that group. And that's wonderful. The organisation should be supporting it. But what if they're not? And I would love to kind of circle back here to what you were saying about the importance of sponsorship and leadership. And my question, I guess, is, have you seen that happening? Do you think ERGs can be misused in some ways as a replacement for really strong and rigorous D&I practice? And with that idea of resourcing and funding, what should great resourcing look like? What should an organization be thinking of putting in, both from a stakeholder and leadership point of view, but from a financial point of view as well? What kind of support do these ERGs and the people running them need to make sure that it's really powerful and significant and impactful?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if I take my own personal view, is that any organization needs to have some kind of cultural plan, and there need to be paid colleagues on the books who are responsible for linking that cultural agenda to the business priorities. That can come in lots of different shapes and sizes, whether that's experienced teams, culture teams, HR functions, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, that's having some kind of dedicated resource that joins the dots across that company, no matter whether it's small, medium, or large. If I take Lloyds as a kind of case in point, we have lots of different teams, obviously being an organisation of kind of 60,000 strong, and we have dedicated people across each of our divisions who are solely focused on culture, colleague engagement, led activities and priorities. Our ERGs, however, are absolutely side of desk. So everyone that does anything ERG-wise does so off the side of the desk. And actually, what I have found myself, and I have seen and heard from other organisations, is that actually sometimes that is and can be much more beneficial for the organisation, because those people are absolutely invested because it's personally important to them. It's not their job. You would like to think that people do something because they enjoy it as their day job. But actually, lots of people do things as part of their day job that actually they're just doing because it's money, it's time, it's who they work with, and so on and so forth. But people who do something off the side of their desk are actually investing a lot of their own personal time, their own personal commitment, and they've got something that's really personally invested, not just from a kind of work perspective. So I think striking the right balance between on the books resourcing and kind of side of desk, I think that kind of work mix works quite well. I think sponsorship is an important one, because ultimately you're only going to be able to progress things if you've got the ear of the right people in an organisation, and more often than not, that will be because somebody senior says, yeah, this is the right thing to do. So actually, I think that's kind of fundamental. That being said, I don't think it's important that that person needs to be a member of any particular community. They could absolutely be an ally leaning in. The fact is that they should absolutely get what they're talking about and get why it's important, and have the status to be able to back that up across the organisation and be seen to be doing that. I think from speaking to other people, sometimes that sponsorship role can be a bit of a tick box. I'll be the sponsor of the Women's Network, or I'll be the sponsor of the ethnicity team. And actually, that never works out in anyone's favour, because it really does need to be authentic. And then from a financial perspective, I would say it's important that there is funding, but a lot of ERGs probably start off their life with little to no funding. And then as the ERG matures, as the company matures and the organisation starts to think more about cultural activity, that's actually when, and they have that almost like light bulb moment, that's actually when the funding comes into play. You mentioned a bit about budgets kind of decreasing and so on post-pandemic, and I think that probably ties back to when you're setting these things up at the beginning, again back to that business case, and kind of continually thinking and trying to spread the word and revisit that. Maybe even it's an evolution of that business case as the company and the culture matures. How do we evolve that as we go? what is the commitment from the leadership of any organisation from a funding perspective. It comes back to that: happy people and engaged people do better. If you've got a horrendous toxic culture, you're going to lose people, you're going to have to retrain them, you're going to actually have to shell out. So actually investing in people and investing in your ERGs is a great way of retaining your talent, being seen as an organisation of choice, and so on.
Yeah, that's great. That we've kind of circled along around this conversation, this hypothetical conversation that's in my mind of this person going to their senior leadership and saying, I want to do this, I want to have a network, I think it's important, and they're making this business case. And so would you say that that's the key stat, really, that the one that can be really powerful, in your opinion, is this engaged employees, work well, work better, stay longer, and it's going to save you money? Is that the key tenet of that business case, if you're making it to a person who's a stakeholder? Or what other things should be in that business case conversation?
I mean, I think at a high level that's it. I think that as we come out of the pandemic and we think about what's going on in society more broadly, there are other factors at play about why it might be important. It's the right thing to do. If you think about, if I maybe play a business case out, actually, if you're investing in some of your technology, you might not get much benefit back from investing the money, but actually you need to stay ahead of the curve against your competitors and so on. So actually, sometimes experience has to be taken into a similar account in terms of returns.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And like I'm listening to the second part of this business case conversation in my head now, where the person who is making this pitch to their senior leadership team is going, but this is what you need to be committing to do. What should someone who is wanting to run an ERG or a network be expecting from the leadership in terms of holding them accountable to their commitment to be the sponsor? What should you expect to see from this person if they're, say, an ally that's leaning in?
I think that's probably a little bit more challenging, because actually what you'll probably find has been my experience, not just with Lloyds, but is that you'll often get allies kind of leaning in to be that sponsor, just given the makeup of senior execs in many of our organisations, and so they will tend to be allies who have in their heart they want to be involved, but sometimes they just need to be led along the way. So it's almost that setting that expectation up front that, I want to come and help you. You need to help me to help you, if you know what I mean. So, you need to tell me what to do, how I can get involved, and I'll give you the commitment that, I'll make the time as much as I can. Because then I suppose, to what I said earlier on, is it's the team that you form underneath you and around you that will actually deliver it. Your sponsor is not going to be your delivery vehicle person. That will be the people all around you, and the more people you can bring on that journey to help you will ultimately, I suppose, help your journey on that.
Yeah, I loved what you were saying earlier about this idea of having ERGs separate from like the broader governance model of the organisation. Allows it to have this passion from people who are genuinely really invested in seeing it do well, because they care deeply about what it's doing. I think that's a really kind of fascinating angle that I hadn't really considered before in light of the whole conversation about financing ERGs. So if we talk about that passionate layer of individuals within an organisation who are involved in a network, how does Lloyds, who, as far as I'm aware, have one of the biggest LGBTQ+ networks I have ever heard of, the number of people you have involved is outstanding. It's just incredible. How do you even go about organising as a side of desk thing? How do you create organising around that ERG organisation for the people involved? What does that look like in a large organisation?
It can be quite complex to try and organise logistic-wise. I mean, ultimately, what you're going to try and do, from my perspective, is set up some kind of steering committee. So likewise, lots of steering committees have a chair. If you go to any of your work forums or committees, you tend to have a chair. Actually, in an ERG, what works well, and it works well for us certainly, is to have co-chairs. Because you're doing it off the side of the desk. You don't always get the same meeting free time. You don't always get the same days off and holidays and things. So actually, thinking about how, and painfully giving yourself time to think about how you set your ERG up in a larger organisation is really important. And so if I think of if I play out a rainbow example, so we've got 3 co-chairs. We have 2 deputy co-chairs, and just like not normal work, but you need to also think about your succession planning and who's going to step into these roles when those people leave, and how we've organised ourselves kind of beneath the co-chairs and deputy co-chairs is that we worked through what's important to people and individuals and where do people's strengths lie. So from a strand perspective, we've got LGBTQ plus individual leads, and generally we try and buddy those people up so that there's there's cover again if people can't make it. I'll come back to our regional team in a second, but we've got internal, external, role model, development leads, and quite often some of that will play into what people do as their day jobs. So if you are in training, HR, development, actually, you could be part of our sub-working group, which looks at professional development. So our network is Rainbow, which is the LGBT plus professional network. So there is that professional element in terms of mentoring, career development, reverse mentoring for some of our senior leaders, which again kind of helps build that advocacy point that we touched on earlier on. And for us as a large organisation, we are spread right across the UK. So actually, doing everything virtual or face-to-face isn't always an option. You do need to have that mix, and people value the community that you get on a local level as well. So whether that's you go along to your local building like I'm in today, and there's an event with 50, 25 people focusing on a particular topic or theme, the value that can bring, not just to the organisation, but also just for those colleagues on the ground to talk and make their voice known and talk about an important topic, is really, really important. So recently we used to have 4 regions, but actually post-pandemic we've refreshed that, and we now have 9, recognising that more people are telling us that they want to engage with our ERGs on a more of a local level.
That's really interesting, hearing a little bit more about how you've organised to make ERGs work best for the actual individual interacting with the wider network and the wider group and the people within that. And it kind of speaks to a question that was raised with us that I'd love to cover. And it's this idea of, so you've got your ERG set up, you've got some activities, you're doing some events, you've set up some mentoring. How do you go about maturing an ERG into a more nuanced and a more complex entity within a big organisation? And I know we've touched on it a little bit here with structure, but what I'm really interested in is, what are some of the challenges and pain points that emerge as you are growing and maturing an established ERG? And some of the things that came up were things like you've mentioned about kind of resourcing and succession planning, but things like, does that ERG eventually become public facing or outward facing rather than just something that's just the knowledge of the employees that are involved, and how do you start to manage some of the more difficult and potentially work political scenarios that arise, where, for instance, we talked about psychological safety earlier, how you ensure that things that are happening within an ERG are still things that can sit within the work context, because I'm sure those types of challenges must emerge, particularly for instance, Rainbow. There's lots going on in the news, and has been for a while now, that circle around this topic. So how do you work through that process of maturing an ERG, given that there must be challenges that emerge on that process?
For us, I think I touched on earlier on around the partnership of having people focusing on engagement, more broadly, and culture across the organisation, but having the ERGs separate. And what that's helps and has helped us to do is almost have that partnership point, in that anything that is Lloyds Banking Group or big organisation or organisation will have a viewpoint, but you'll also have a membership viewpoint. So sometimes Rainbow's view is not aligned with Lloyds Banking Group's view, because there's different political, reputational, and almost maybe risks that sometimes it's easier to accept in a network group. If I, as Chris, have an opinion, then I might want to talk about that opinion in my safe space within Rainbow. My opinion, maybe might not be relevant or appropriate for Lloyds Banking Group. And if you then kind of build that up to our membership of 3,000 that we've got, actually, sometimes you'll get some of these differing views, which having that partnership and being separate, actually, you can almost be a bit of an advisory group. You sometimes play more of an advisory role from an ERG perspective into an organisation. I think as ERGs mature, as you say, we've touched on kind of resourcing and things, but actually there's a lot that can be shared and learnt from what other organisations are doing. So building those partnerships. From a Rainbow perspective, I think of an organisation called Interbank, which some people might be familiar with, and that's bringing together LGBT plus colleagues, networks, allies from different organisations together, again, to try and share best practice. So thinking about what other organisations might be doing, how you can engage with those organisations, thinking about what people in those ERGs actually want. It's easy for leaders sometimes to say, well, I think we need to focus on, A, B, and C, and then you speak to colleagues and actually you want to focus on B, E, and F. So member feedback and using, polling people in the networks, polling colleagues, getting feedback and listening to colleagues actually is a really great way of maturing those networks, because you can evolve and think about what people want to focus on. You mentioned kind of social issues. I mean, that's certainly something that we're kind of leaning in just now, and place to that advisory point. As an organisation, what is our stance on gender identity, conversion therapy? There's lots of different topics, and I know I'm just kind of playing through some of the LGBT plus things at the moment, but the same exists, across the board. In the aftermath of what some of the things that happened in the US, we started our race advisory group. We started and built a race action plan. So it's not limited specifically to any one demographic or ERG. There are things that will happen externally, internally, that will help mature and evolve your ERG naturally, organically sometimes. And then finally, the last bit I maybe touch on is growing that membership. So, what is the ERG's USP? So, what are you doing that makes colleagues, individuals want to come and engage with that network? So growing the membership is key. If you've got 5 people who join the network and they're all really engaged and they're happy, well, that's great. But you'll have the same people doing the same things all the time, because you won't pass the baton on, and you won't bring more people in with different views, and that won't help mature the network. So I think growing the membership for me would definitely be the kind of the final key as part of that.
That's so interesting, the idea of the USP and what are you doing that's delivering, that's giving value to everyone in the network. What is the network bringing? I would love to I know it's a cheeky question, but tell us about some of these USPs as an organisation with leading employee resource groups in the UK. What are your USPs? What are you giving back to your network?
I wish I had a slide up that could tell me this. We used to be, if I think back to when we formed with an LGBT plus network group, it wasn't as societally acceptable to be gay or to be out, and actually a lot of our activity at that time was focused on networking. colleagues meeting, well, just people meeting like-minded people to talk about common things that were important to them, and over the years that has evolved to us becoming the professional network, where actually we are now prioritizing things that I kind of mentioned, you know, career coaching, development, people investing in time, succession planning, training. That has kind of evolved as we've kind of gone on. So we are kind of seen as the professional network, and those are some of the things that we offer. We offer things for our allies. So we have allies courses, allies guides. We have an allies team that can actually help you. I think there's another bit around visual identity and a sense of belonging for people in an ERG. So that could be as simple as, I've just got my new delivery in, but our rainbow lanyards, you know, and that's a great way of growing your membership and growing interest. Conversation sparkers, you know, how, oh, that's colourful, where did you get one of those, what's that all about? You know, some of these very easy things, and actually they help build that sense of belonging for people, just talking and engaging with a particular topic. So for me, that's probably the USP of Rainbow as it is just now, and also now, you know, as you grow and mature, it's how do you then use that platform to help others as well, things like that.
So that's interesting. How are you using that platform? Because I would love to, this actually tailors beautifully to something that I've got noted down here that I would love to ask you, which is that so you're passionate about the Rainbow Network. I'm sure there's someone else at Lloyds who is really passionate about race. How what kind of crossover is there between ERGs that are formed within the organisation? Surely there's rich opportunity for cross collaboration, and also to be able to recognise that there are really interesting and difficult intersectional concerns that arise at the junctures of these different ERGs and interest networks. Would you be able to give us a bit of an overview, I guess, of that kind of way
sure.
of standing out?
Sure. I mean, we probably have 5 formal colleague networks, so the usual ones that you would expect: sexual orientation, gender identity, our women's network, our ethnic minority network, our family network, and our disability network are our kind of core 5. And they've always been, they're probably the legacy networks, if you like. And what we've seen in recent years is actually more and more colleagues want to get involved and are passionate about wider topics. You know, in recent years, we've now got a Sikh network, a Muslim network, a baby loss and fertility network. You know, these are just some examples, but, you know, new networks and ERGs, and, you know, probably in some of the instances, they are just, I mentioned it up front, they are just small groups of people who are really passionate about something, and they are growing and maturing, you know, day, week, month, year, and into something a bit more substantial. And what is really important for us is to think about the intersectionality of these things. You know, you could be a gay Muslim man, you could be a disabled father. You know, everything is kind of intersectional, and what we try and so we each of the networks now has an intersectionality lead who is kind of sole focus is to think about how do I join up with my peers in the other networks and think about how areas of overlap and collaboration. And you know, an example from Rainbow is, you know, we've got International Women's Day coming up at the beginning of March. We've got Trans Day Visibility at the end of March. How do we actually work and collaborate, Rainbow and Breakthrough, on creating a really engaging event that addresses some things that are going on just now, that helps colleagues know that the organisation's behind them, and caters for a wider cross range of people.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to kind of ask about that dynamic, because you were talking about the wider cross range of people. There may be people who are new to the idea of ERGs, maybe a little bit resistant, higher, you know, senior senior people in businesses who are going, well, that sounds like an awful lot of ERGs, and now we're making it even more niche by bringing two intersectional views and layering them on top of each other. And I would love to ask this question, and I genuinely don't have an answer myself. I'm really keen to get your thoughts. Are there any other benefits to taking an intersectional approach by layering ERG activity and combining it that go beyond just focusing on that intersection? So, for instance, women who are ethnic minorities, for example, is doing activity between a race or ethnicity ERG and a gender-based ERG going to benefit people beyond people who sit in that intersection?
And I would say yes, because ultimately if you're tapping into the, well, let's just take two networks, that's going to open up a bigger pool of people who will come to events, who will learn, who will take those stories home. We talk about the amount of time you spend in work. I've lost count of the number of times there's been a topic that we've covered in any one of these sessions that we have here at Lloyds, who then goes home and says, oh, that was a conversation starter for my husband, my family over the dinner table. And it's not necessarily going to impact everybody in the organisation, but actually it does have there is the opportunity for it to impact people beyond an organisation, and to change hearts and minds and build societal culture as well, depending on who you speak to, the size and scale of the organisation and so on. And for a lot of people, it's that understanding piece about other people's perspectives, beliefs, and cultures that really helps gel an organisation together. And that's certainly what we found here, is that's been a really key enabler for kind of building and evolving that culture.
That's brilliant. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk through this topic with me today. I would love to give you the opportunity to just close things out with, what have we missed? What are the key things that we may not have talked about already, or the key learns that people need to be aware of if they're looking at an employee network or an ERG? Crystallize it down into a BuzzFeed version for me. What's the key takeaway here?
Well, that's taking me back, BuzzFeed. I mean, for me, it would be having the right setup and structure, having the right level of support, and then having a really, really engaged group of people who are willing to help you with it. I think if you've got those kind of three core components, that's going to set the foundations to be able to deliver anything.
That's fantastic. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. That's brilliant. I would love to close off our discussion here and really just open it up if there's anyone else in the group that would like to ask any questions to Chris. Cool. Looks like everyone is absolutely taken away by everything we've discussed already, Chris. So all good by the looks of things. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining this call, for taking the opportunity to come and listen to a fantastic person with incredible credentials when it comes to this kind of thing. Great to see you all today. So thanks very much. And Chris, thanks again for joining us.